Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. Today we've got an interesting discussion. I've got two theologians, Seth Hart and Ādi Puruṣa. They're both doing PhDs in the moment. Ādi Puruṣa is doing one on the problem of evil, so he's very expert for this topic. And Seth has written papers on this subject before, so we'll get right into it. Ādi Puruṣa is going to give us a description of the problem of evil.
All right, thanks for having me here, Arjuna. So, the problem of evil, basically, according to certain theological frameworks like Christianity and Caitanya Vaiṣṇavism, which is the tradition that I represent, God is held to be all good, He's all-powerful, and He's all-knowing. And because He's all good, that means that He'd want to prevent any evil from taking place. Because He's all-powerful, He would have the power to prevent evil. And because He's all-knowing, He would have the ability to know how to stop evil. And yet, even though God has all these different qualities, we still find that evil exists in this world. So, generally, atheists or generally people who are against the existence of God would argue that because evil exists, then either God is not all good, God's not all-knowing, God's not all-powerful, or God doesn't exist altogether. So the problem of evil is a challenge to theism because it sort of indicates or suggests that God, as He's commonly depicted, can't possibly exist. So in response to the problem of evil, different philosophers and theologians generally put forth what's known as a Theodicy. So it's basically, a Theodicy is basically a way of justifying the existence of God even in the light of evil. So there's different Theodicies that different philosophers and theologians have put throughout. They may argue that actually the evil that we exist is not evil at all, and that it serves a greater good, and because the evil that we experience actually serves this greater good, then it's not inconsistent that evil exists. Evil coexists with God. And there's also generally two different types of evil. There's moral evil, which is the evil caused by other human agents, and natural evil, which is evil caused by natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. So for a theologian who's trying to defend the existence of God, their goal is to basically explain how, even though there's evil in the world, it's justified in the light of an all-loving, all-good, and an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God. So that's the problem of evil. And actually, I should also mention that there's a logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. And the logical problem of evil is it's basically trying to show that the coexistence of evil and God are basically inconsistent with with each other. And nowadays, so that used to be popular for some time. Now it's more popular is what's called the evidential problem of evil. So, we see so much suffering in this world, so much, earthquakes, famine, coronavirus. And, just from an evidential perspective, just from what we see, it can seem hard to imagine that there is a God in the light of the extreme suffering that we witness throughout human history. So that's generally considered to be the more pressing sort of variation of the problem of evil nowadays. So yeah, maybe Seth can add anything if I missed anything.
No, that was great. The only thing I would add is that some people actually throw in the third problem of evil, which is the emotional problem of evil. So it falls outside of the sort of philosophical discourse. And I bring it up just because you see a lot of philosophers who want to distinguish that. Hey, don't take my defense, my theodicy, as trying to solve your emotional angst with this. This is purely a logical exercise that at the end of the day, you might still feel emotionally that evil and God cannot coexist together. But as far as the pure logic of the situation goes, that can't be defended quite as easily, according to these certain theodicies. So I would just throw that in there.
Yeah, that's good.
I thought that some of them conflated the emotional problem with the evidential problem.
Maybe you could speak more to that. I have seen some that have sort of erred along that lines, yes. Perhaps Ādi could throw in something else on that.
Yeah, I guess I haven't focused so much on the emotional... Well, the context I've seen the emotional problem, some people sort of have used it as a way to shy away from doing any kind of theodicy altogether. Some people say that, just trying to understand the existence of evil through sort of logical means is just like it's almost like a heartless exercise, and it's better just to try to console people through it.
Right.
That's kind of the context I've seen it. But you could probably, I can see why one would include the emotional problem under the evidential problem. Different, yeah. As far as these kind of technical things, I think people have different opinions and kind of different ways that they conceptualize it.
I don't know how you separate them, though, because the evidential problem is saying, why would God allow, babies to have cancer or so on? And at the root of that is really an emotion that says that babies shouldn't suffer.
Rooting out the distinction here is often difficult, which is why whenever you see these sort of analytic attempts, they get to they try really hard. They often come across very dry and unsatisfying, even though they're logically rigorous.
Well, I think the emotional...
Read Swinburne.
The epistemology of evil is emotion, really. So that's how it gets messy. Anyway, why don't we launch into it, and Seth, you can give us your solution to the problem of evil.
Sure thing. So I'm representing the Christian viewpoint as if my background doesn't give that away. So within Western culture, the tropes of the Christian response to the problem of evil are quite common. You had a primordial paradise, an original paradise, a fall event, Adam and Eve, a rescue attempt. So instead of going through this in a prolonged period, I'd really want to focus in. I'll briefly go through that, but I really want to focus in on areas that I think where Ādi and I actually have a little bit of clash. And that was a bit of an issue because Ādi was generous enough to forward me some of his work so that we could sort of have a better idea of where we were coming from. And I came to realize that he and I actually share far more in common in our theodicy than we are different. We both believe in an original paradise state. We both believe in a fall. We both believe in a redemption. So a lot of it, the areas that we're coming from are fairly identical. So launching straight into it, though, what Christians believe is that in the beginning, God did create humanity in a state of innocence. Now, I use the word innocence instead of the word moral perfection, which is sometimes thrown in there, that Adam and Eve, that the original humans were perfect. That's not technically correct. What they were is they were finite and they were ignorant and they were innocent of evil. And his creation of them was for the purpose of being co-regents that stood between heaven and earth. Humans, having both a spiritual and a material nature, a combination of the both, stood as a sort of connection point between heaven and earth. They could serve as priests that go between heaven and earth. And that way, they had communion both with God and with the human world, and therefore could serve as co-regents. And in that communion with God, we were granted eternal life. That is only granted through communion with God, who is life himself in Christian theology. But nevertheless, we were finite, we were limited, we were ignorant. We were created this way because certain things like virtue, Christians mostly hold to a virtue ethic, is the idea that virtue is cultivated, it's grown in time, it's something that is experienced and grown in relationship with other people. Therefore, it's not something God could create ex nihilo, something out of nothing. It has to be grown. But what that also means is that if God were to give us libertarian free will, the capacity to err, we would also have the capacity to choose to choose to reject that and leave that perfect state. So in Christian teaching, that's exactly what happened. The original couple in an isolated pocket of paradise called Eden, something that was isolated to a small region, humans chose to err. This is logically necessary for God to create humans in a way that they could sin if he is to grant them libertarian free will and the capacity to cultivate virtue. That's something I think Ādi and I agree on to a greater extent. And that's what we call the fall event. Now, what caused the fall? Now, in Christian theology, it was through deception and temptation to be like God. Now, to be like God is not a bad thing. It's actually our natural end, according to Christian theology. But we did it in a way that was outside the will of God. It was a sort of a jump ahead. Now, I'm pulling a lot from the theologian Irenaeus here, and I'm doing a terrible disservice by how quickly I'm going through this. But through the act of deception by a serpent figure, which I'll come back to, and a temptation to be like God, outside of the will of God, led to the corruption of human nature. So human nature is corrupted, and Christians debate about, there's a debate between original sin and original guilt. Are we actually guilty of the sin of our ancestors, or is it merely just corrupt our nature to the point that we will sin, but we're only accountable for our own sins? Now, I'm going to do a sort of broad church perspective, so I'm only going to focus on original sin, which says we're not necessarily guilty of the sin of our ancestors, but we do have this original corruption, which makes us sinful beings. And I think this allows us to see why much of the evil in the world exists. Moral evil accounts for, if we take this seriously, it accounts for the vast majority of the problems that we have. When we allow God, by allowing a libertarian free will, the ability to freely choose, to not be determined, God has created the possibility for evil actions. And as a discussion Ādi and I were having before, Alvin Plantinga has shown that this is a very logically defensible position to hold. As far as the logical problem of evil, as he mentioned, is actually been considered pretty definitively shown to be false. That's why a lot of the argument has shifted to the evidential, because Alvin Plantinga has shown that libertarian free will allows for the coexistence of natural evil, which he brought up earlier. Okay. All right. So going back to natural evil, how do we account for natural evil as Christians? Well, going back to the garden, we see that there was already evil forces at work, at play, even in this primordial paradise. And what that allows us to conjecture is that there was a fall before the fall. And so Christians throughout the centuries, and even prior to Christianity in the intertestamental period, there's been a tradition of spiritual beings that have fallen away. So humans were not the only libertarian free agents that fell. Now, Christians have also accounted for many natural evils through this primordial fall of these angelic beings. So what I propose is that the easiest solution to the problem of natural evil is an extension of libertarian free will to include natural evils through these angelic beings. It's because of them, because of their action, these evil action, that we can understand why the natural world continues to work against us and work against the goodness that would have otherwise been. And there's plenty of Christians who've come on board with this. We've already mentioned Alvin Plantinga, who has proposed this. There's also Hans Urs von Balthasar in the Catholic tradition. You have Wolfhard Pannenberg in the Protestant tradition. So it has a long tradition going for it. Now, if I'm going to talk about a Christian theodicy, I have to bring up Christ, because everything sort of goes back to him. Because the question now is what happens to evil? Has God just simply left us in this evil state because of our choice? And the answer is no. Because just like the first Adam corrupted our nature at our origin, so Christ, who is the second Adam, that Scripture calls him the second Adam, redeems our nature and will complete, in order to us to complete the end that he originally gave for us. So the very same freedom that corrupted us, now we have the freedom that can save us. So through one man sin entered into the world, and through one man redemption is offered now to all. And what I feel this offers in the Christian viewpoint that is unique is that it is an answer to both the emotional and the intellectual problem of evil, which is why I wanted to bring that up. Mm-hmm. Emotionally, it helps us to understand that God doesn't sit aloft from evil. He enters into the trenches and does something drastic to defeat it. He does something amazing in order to rescue us. To me, that's a much easier God to be able to have a relationship with, one who understands our sufferings, rather than a God who sits aloft from it. And it gives also a sense of meaning to suffering, because at the cross, we see perhaps the greatest act of evil in history, and a completely innocent man suffer. And yet it also is the greatest act of good in history. Now, why do I say this helps us solve the emotional problem of evil? And this is what I want to say. Evil isn't truly evil if it has a meaning. One of the most painful experiences I've been told that a human could go through is childbirth. Yet in discussions of the problem of evil in Theodicies, childbirth is virtually never brought up. Why? Because there is a sense of meaning to it. And by looking at Christ and seeing that as an exemplar of what suffering is, that suffering has meaning, we as Christians can understand our own sufferings as having meaning too. And that in some way takes away that emotional burden of evil. Intellectually, the intellectual problem of evil, that allows us to see evil as both alien to God's intention, yet instrumental in bringing about greater goodness. And I go back to the cross. It was alien to God's intention that he would have to come and die. And yet it was instrumental in bringing about the greatest goodness. Now I want to go ahead and move along. I've probably taken up too much time already, to the eschatology. And this allows us to see at the end state will be what the original creation was supposed to fulfill. Eden was an isolated place that was meant to expand. Because of human corruption, it never did. The end state will be the perfection of that. So Christ completes the task of humanity by becoming a human and can truly act as a high priest, that bridge between heaven and earth. By being both God and man, he acts to fulfill the destiny of man by being that perfect bridge. And the church, we are both the recipients of that perfecting grace, and we also participate in bringing that grace to the world. So we live that in proleptically within ourselves. We bring grace to the world. We bring that in ahead of time. And that is the point of the church, is that is the sort of influx of God's grace, this perfecting grace into the world. And I could say a lot more, but I should probably end there and let you talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was good. That was well articulated. So I represent the Caitanya Vaiṣṇava or Gaudiya Vaishnava perspective, or Caitanya Vaishnava perspective. You can refer it either way, or the Hare Krishna perspective, as is commonly known. So I guess where I'll first start is, so the origin of evil in this world is very similar to what Seth described as a sort of fall from a higher state. So the Caitanya Vaishnava view is that human beings, or were really souls, were originally in a sort of paradise-like state with God, where they enjoyed a life of unending bliss with God. And then because to love God, in order to love God, we have to have free will. God can't coerce us to love him. Coerced love is like a logical contradiction. It's like a square circle. It can't exist. So in order to have the ability to love God and experience the highest joy that we can experience, we also have to have free will and the ability to love God of our own accord without being forced. So because God gives us this free will, it means that we have the capacity to misuse our free will. Now, if God gave us free will and somehow made it so we weren't able to misuse it, then it wouldn't really be free will. It would, an agent that has free will but is prevented from doing certain things really doesn't have free will. It's like a square circle. It's just a logical contradiction. So even though God originally has us be with him, because we have this free will, some souls are curious to understand what it's like to live a life separate from God. And because some souls are just curious, God produces this world that we have here, this we call like the physical world or the material world. And God doesn't want us to leave. He would rather us be with him. But a free agent can only make a informed choice if they have knowledge of all their possibilities. And for certain souls, they may want knowledge of all their possibilities. And one of those possibilities is to be separate from God. So in trying to explore that possibility, these souls fall down, similar to what Seth described. The main difference between the Caitanya Vaishnava perspective is that each soul is responsible for their own fall. Actually, according to our saints and teachers, less than 10% of souls actually fall. By and large, most souls actually stay in the paradise realm with God, or what we say the spiritual world. So, a vast minority, even though it seems like there's a lot of human beings and other living beings in this world, actually only a vast minority of souls actually fall. So they fall into this world, and that explains why we're here in the first place, why we're here in a world that does have earthquakes and tsunamis and coronavirus and police brutality and all that. So I think me and Seth are pretty much on the same page, more or less. There are some minor differences, but we're on a similar page as far as that goes. But where we differ now is that once the soul is in this world, the reason he suffers, or he or she suffers, is because of karma. A lot of people have an awareness of karma nowadays, like, what goes around comes around in one sense. Karma is basically the idea that for every action that we have, there's a corresponding consequence to that action. So if I punch someone in the face, it'll be my karmic reaction to get punched in this face myself. So karma explains, in one sense, why good things happen to bad people, why bad things happen to good people, why we have to experience suffering. It's because we do an act, and then because we perform some action, and it has, we perform a bad action, we get a bad consequence in response. And Seth made an interesting point. He mentioned that, evil isn't evil if it has a meaning. So karma, too, is not meant to just punish us for its own sake, but it's actually meant to rectify us and teach us lessons so that we can ultimately return back to God. Because even though we've fallen away from God, we can always go back. And actually, the Hare Krishna view is that ultimately every soul has the capacity to go back to God, and that's because not only is there karma, this kind of cosmic law that rewards or punishes us according to our deeds, but there's also reincarnation. So if the soul doesn't perfect itself and go back to God in this life, it can keep on reincarnating across different bodies until it finally learns its lessons and develops love for God, and then goes back to the spiritual world. So, so that's karma. But in addition to karma, if a soul decides to turn back to God and performs what we call bhakti, or basically loving devotion to God, then it can actually, that's actually the way that the soul returns to God, is by developing its love for God fully. And when the soul practices bhakti, it can destroy its karmic, its karma, basically. So it can, the soul is no longer under its karma, and the soul is in God's hands at that point. And even though the soul is in God's hands, it doesn't mean the soul doesn't experience suffering, but it basically means that God personally arranges or orchestrates suffering for the devotee to teach that devotee lessons that'll bring it back to him. So in that sense, the evil and suffering that we experience is really meant to rectify us and teach us lessons, and it's ultimately a greater good. There may be some suffering, but in the light of going back to God and enjoying a life of eternal bliss with Him, the suffering is sort of the ends justify the means. So that's it in a nutshell. So just to sort of recap what I've said, there's the soul falls, then once it's in the world, there's karma, and karma is notable because God doesn't force the soul to suffer. Karma means that the soul, through its own freely chosen actions, creates its own happiness and distress. And then beyond that, if a soul decides to turn to God, they can have their karma destroyed, and God personally produces suffering for that devotee. So I think I've talked for a while. That's kind of it in a nutshell. Each one of those points can be elaborated in some greater depth, but I think that's a good place to end that.
Okay, Seth, do you want, what are we going to do next? Do you want to offer some objections to Seth's Theodicy now? Ādi Puruṣa?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One is, so I guess we can debate how long to spend on this point, but I guess one challenge is, why do humans have to suffer for another person's sins? Why do we have to suffer for Adam and Eve's sins, even though, we didn't actually do anything to be placed in our situation of sin? It was sort of imposed on us. So that's one point. Another point is, the problem of why certain people are placed into better circumstances than others from the time of their birth. Why someone's born rich and has everything handed to them, why someone else is poor and suffers and because of their situations that they were born in and had no control over, if there's no notion of reincarnation. And another is natural evil. What determines whether or not someone, even if it's caused by moral agents, is it arbitrary? Is there some sort of structure behind it? Because if I'm walking down the street and I get struck by a lightning bolt for out of the blue for no reason, it would be unfair for that to happen to me unjustly, unless I did something to deserve it, or if it taught me some sort of spiritual lesson. And I'm kind of throwing a lot. We may not be able to address all of these, but another really important question to ask in the context of problem of evil is also, one of the greatest evils you can possibly imagine is that someone is damned forever. Someone is permanently in a state, like a hell-like state where they're disconnected from God. And what's good about reincarnation is that there is no permanent hell for the soul. They always can grow throughout their lives, and they're never permanently in a state where they're just disconnected from God and have no hope of redemption. They can hope to be redeemed, if not in this life, then some future life. And I think, I think some of those are probably pretty good for now.
All right. You ready for me to respond?
Yeah.
Great. I actually really appreciated those. Two of the points, so I counted the 4 points. 2 of them are actually connect really well with objections I have to your system, so I think this will be a good back and forth.
Yeah.
And the other 2, I think I have a similar answer, so I'll try and get to both of those.
Okay.
So to start off, why do we suffer for the sins of Adam and Eve, the sins of some primordial parents? And I think this connects really well with the objection that I have with the karmic system, which is that it feels far too individualistic for me. Within Christian theology, our shared humanity is far more fundamental than any of our individuality, despite what we're taught in the West. So, to quote Dostoevsky, it might be a line that you're familiar with: everyone is responsible for everyone and everything. And that to me is this very huge summation. So the idea that I come into this world and I'm only responsible for my own evils, there's something that sits with me a little bit too individualistic, whenever a far greater morality is one that there's a person suffering on the other end of the world, and I am responsible for that, to that person. And I'm responsible to every other person. And so our shared humanity, when you understand that the Christian ontology or Christian anthropology, theological anthropology, is that you need to understand the fundamentality of our shared human nature outweighs our individuality, then I begin to see more why the sins of others, I'm responsible in some sense for them. And that also makes sense of the redemption in Christ, right? Because I'm not responsible for what Christ did, and yet it's still bestowed to me. That's why he can be the second Adam, the second man, because his works are bestowed to me. And so that's sort of an answer to me, and that sort of connects to another issue, which is the idea of altruism, right? If everything is about me, this idea that what makes an action good, I'm motivated completely by my own sort of self-perfection. I struggle with the idea of forgiveness there. So it's a question. It's more of a question than an actual objection. Is what is the place of forgiveness within the karmic system? Now, is it truly now for me to say someone else? Is it purely just for my own purification? That's one question. But also, can God Himself forgive? Can He truly wipe away someone's sin without, without any sort of karmic payback, or essentially? So that's one question. You also brought up eternal damnation, and that's another thing. Because I noticed that you do believe in the sort of universalism that everyone eventually makes it back, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think this connects with my idea of free will. Free will to me is only meaningful if our choices have eternal values. And the analogy I like to think about is imagine a mouse maze where every turn you make, it all ends up right back at the same point, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you've given the mouse choices, but those choices ultimately don't matter in the end if he ends up at the same place. Those choices have no meaning, and no more meaning than if you just gave him the straight path, because he always ends up back at the same place. So free will seems to lose a bit of its value if there are no eternal consequences. If everyone sort of ends up at the same place, what was the point of freedom to begin with? So to me, free will actually has more meaning, has that meaning that we needed, that you and I both needed to have, if we have this possibility for eternal damnation. I should also mention that eternal damnation is not universally held by Christians. David Bentley Hart, John Milbank, two maybe of the greatest theologians in the world, both universalists. But since I don't particularly hold to that view, I just want to throw that out there, that I'm not necessarily defending of sort of encompassing Christianity here. And finally, you brought up why do some suffer more? Why do some suffer more, and why is there natural evil? And I think the answer to both of these is the idea. I know you've worked with Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig's probably work as well. Correct?
Middle knowledge.
Middle knowledge. I'm not going to appeal to middle knowledge, but I'm going to appeal to the idea sort of brought out from that idea, which is the idea of someone who's suffering. Say someone who's born impoverished and another person who's born rich. Those within the Christian narrative, within the Christian framework, your individual placement might look bad from a sort of finite perspective, but within the overall perspective, it's mostly the poor people. Blessed are the poor, because it's those who, by and large, have embraced the Christian narrative and received salvation. And so, in retrospect, looking in hindsight from the Christian narrative, it might be more of a question of why the rich were allowed to be rich than why the poor were allowed to be poor. And the same might go for natural suffering as well, that there is sort of a meaning built into it, that God sort of controls the narrative, that these sort of events and the sort of middle knowledge perspective, you don't have to hold the middle knowledge, but I'm appealing to that since I figured you that you researched through this, that there is a sort of ultimate end to that. If I may, can I level one more objection real quickly?
Yeah, sure.
So you talk about curiosity, like God presenting us with all the possibilities, right? And for our residency. And if I might pull a quote from something, is that all right if I pull a quote from something? In order to be vindicated, this is from page 89 of what you sent me, in order to be vindicated from any charges of directly generating or producing a self-suffering, God must therefore provide the self with adequate knowledge of all its residential options in order for the self to make a fully informed decision as to where it wants to live. Now that struck me because the idea seems to be that we did make a fully informed decision and left God. But to know God in his infinite goodness is to know God as infinitely good. And so any other finite choice will be infinitely less than the fullness of God. Which to me, I mean, any libertarian freedom will always rule out that if you have no desire for something, you're not going to choose it, which is why I'm not scared. I'm going to start, to try to do a backflip right now. I have no desire to do that. And that's not any sort of limitation on my free will. So the question is how can we be fully informed if we know God and his infinite goodness, and yet there still be finite, and there be finite goods, and we be tempted by those? And also, whatever answer you give to that, how will this prevent us from falling again? So that's it. That's
okay.
Those are my objections.
That was good. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I droned on. You can shut me up anytime you want.
No, this is good. This is good. So, Yeah. So, as far as the individualistic and shared humanity, that's an interesting point. My response to that, I think unfortunately, it'll probably be hard to get in depth into each one of these, but the idea in Gaudiya Vaishnavism is that we're all parts and parcels of God, as our founder used to mention. So, in one sense, we all have our individual existence. We are distinct individuals, me, you, and Arjuna. But in one sense, we have a shared identity because we're all parts of God, and in that sense, we have a shared brotherhood. We have a spiritual brotherhood. So, I think it is still. I think there is scope to have a shared humanity, even though we're all in charge of our own individual kind of karmic baggage, because we may be individuals, but in one sense, we're united in that we're all one family of God. So the impetus we have to help others is the fact that you're my brother and Arjun's my brother, and I want to see my spiritual brothers and sisters be uplifted and free from suffering. And the idea of compassion also. The more we advance spiritually, the more we should feel the sufferings of others as the suffering of our own. There's a Sanskrit term, paradukkha dukhi, which indicates this. So I guess my response would be that our shared humanity doesn't necessarily come from a sharing of our karmic baggage, but a sharing of our ultimate identity as fellow parts of God. So that's one. And then two, the place of forgiveness. I guess the ultimate aim of, ultimately what God wants is our love. And the ultimate aim of any sort of punishment really is to rectify so that we can come back to that love. So from God's perspective, He just loves us purely. He loves us unconditionally, and He doesn't want anything from us. He only wants our own highest benefit, which is, our highest benefit is actually to love God. So He's willing to forgive us even though we've done so many things because He's completely pure. But as far as your question of can He wipe away sin without payback, one kind of nuance is that God, when He burns karma, He may sometimes leave some traces of that karma just to teach us lessons. So by having those traces, God can teach us lessons. So in one sense, it's like God forgives us and sort of clears a lot of the slate, but He leaves some things there just so we can really learn our lesson. And I would argue that in order for someone to really be forgiven, they have to really, from the bottom of their hearts, be fully repentant of what they've done. And by allowing these token traces of karma, God can enable us to really learn the lessons we're meant to, and really come back to Him with a really, really wanting to come back to Him and really sort of, you could say, repentant for having turned away from Him. So then there's that. So your question on free will was, as far as ending up in the same destination, that's interesting. Because I would argue that the way you describe free will is kind of like a fatalistic outcome. But I would argue that to have libertarian free will means that at any point, you could choose between X and Y. There's no point in which you've decided, okay, I want X, and now I want X forever. To have libertarian free will means that you always have the capacity to choose between your available options. And if you have the opportunity to choose between all your available options, then I argue it doesn't make sense that the soul permanently chooses to be damned, because there's no state at which it could not choose to want to turn to God. And you could argue that the other flip side is true, and you've actually mentioned that. And actually, maybe I'll get to that later. But that would be my main rejoinder to that: is that it wouldn't make sense for us to be permanently disconnected from God, even if we chose to, and even if we're heading in a certain way. The idea is that naturally the soul wants to love God. That's its sort of natural condition. And through learning lessons, the soul can give up its willingness to turn away from God, and the soul can learn lessons and shape its character and ultimately turn back to God of its own accord.
I think analogies would be useful for that point. Like if you say, children have free will and they can grow up and they can be homeless, or they can have a job and a family, and they can make life decisions that will make them end up in one or the other. And if you say life goes on for infinity, eventually everybody's going to end up with a roof over their head and family relationships and so on. You're not going to have people living in the gutter with drug addiction for eternity, because that's just not a desirable state to be in. Eventually, anybody who's gone down that road will figure out they're not happy there, get their life together, and come to a desirable way of living. So to say that everyone will eventually achieve perfection with God is really just to say that there's enough time that people can make up their mind where they're going to go, and that's always the option of choosing God, and choosing God is objectively more desirable than being separate from God.
Yeah, it's good. It's like, let me try to think of another analogy. It's like if, it's like clearly objectively better to, like eat some nice ice cream rather than just like some like stale, rotten potato chips you found in your couch that have been there for like 3 months. Let's just say, like, for the sake of argument, like, it's objectively better to have that ice cream than that potato chip. Now, to have libertarian free will means you always have the choice to have that nasty potato chip. But if you're, I don't know, if you're aware of your highest benefit, you choose that ice cream because you know it's better and it's objectively better, and it's, you know, you can see that it's giving you more satisfaction, and you've had so much satisfaction from that you don't even want that potato chip, even though you have the choice. So it's similar to that with God. Through learning lessons, we can learn to see that a life away from Him is like that nasty potato chip, and that, you know, God is like that ice cream. And it doesn't necessarily, knowing that God is that ice cream and knowing we can be happier with God doesn't mean that we don't have the choice, but it means that we know that God's better. So I would argue that eternal damnation, in contrast, is like saying that, you know, you have that potato chip and you've just decided forever that you're going to choose that potato chip when you could alternatively learn that the ice cream is better. So now to come to the last point, I think when I wrote that God has to provide souls with knowledge of all its possible options. It's not, and one of those options must be God. It's not that the soul necessarily needs to know God in full. It's just that the soul needs to know that you know, God is there, and the soul can never know God in full. It can never know understand God
stick
completely.
On one point for a little bit and then move on. Seth can reply to this topic.
Okay. Is that good? Okay.
Might be a better flow if we just stay on one point and then change subject and leave one point behind.
That's good.
Okay.
I'd mute myself. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, there were actually 3 points there. Do you want me just to focus on the last one?
Yeah, I think the first two I think are. I think the last one is actually the most interesting. So yeah, I think that would be better dialogue.
Okay. I do find point 2 with the forgiveness thing. If we have time, I really would actually like to come back to it. But let's take you're right. Point 3 is interesting. Yeah, so I should clarify. So, yes, I understand the sort of transcendental fixation, the sort of transcendental determination of us towards goodness, right? I wouldn't actually deny that at all. So I should clarify that I'm not saying that I don't think free will is possible if we're all ultimately determined. My point is that the free will is not meaningful. Because if our choices, and that's why I use the sort of mouse illustration, is why give us free choice at all if we all end up in the same place. So there's still a determination of our will toward an end. So even though our individual choices are not determined, they're indeterministic, our path is determined. And so the question, so it's still a deterministic system. And to me, like you and I agree, is free will has value in and of itself, sort of an intrinsic intrinsic value. I will reply with the whole hell thing. Free will always operates on individuals, and individuals are developed through habits, which is why I consistently talked about virtue, right? So say the first time you try to ride a bike, it's real hard, and you're very conscious of the action, you're making all these choices, right? And eventually, after you develop a habit and do it, eventually when you're riding a bike, you're not even choosing to anymore. It just becomes part of your nature. And so freedom is always for the development of a nature, right? And so in Christian theology, to choose sort of anti-nature, to choose sin, to choose evil, a sort of self-destructive action, that too can become a habit. And there is a sort of fixation, a final fixation in that, to where just like a bike, it becomes second nature. It's something you can't even choose anymore. So there is, in a sense, a destruction of the free will based upon the choices we make now. That's why I think this, like, the current life is so vital in the Christian system, because it has sort of these ultimate outcomes, because we're always on a trajectory either toward good or toward evil. And there's also, I might throw in another possible solution that I just want to throw out to my annihilationist friends, is that there is a complete annihilation, and that's what hell is. That's a growing position within evangelical circles. I'll throw that out to them. So anyway.
Yeah, it's good. I have it's good. I like this. This is making me think more than I had. So, yeah. I normally do. Yeah.
I'm not good at coming up with my own ideas. Just talking to other people there.
Regarding the destruction of free will, I'd say what really happens is you develop certain tastes or preferences, and those preferences, to some extent, dictate what you do with your free will. So this is a big idea in Bhagavad Gita, that by acquiring a higher taste, you give up the lower. So, somebody who's, addicted to drugs, and that prevents them from being able to play sport, and then they start playing soccer a lot, and they figure out that their drug habits are preventing them from being able to play soccer, and they're getting a higher taste from playing soccer, so they give up their drug habits in order to better serve their higher taste and better facilitate that. So has their development in a taste for playing soccer destroyed their free will by making it so they can't choose drugs anymore? It's just like adding another layer of analysis to it.
So free will is always, I'm going to get into my thesis a bit. Free will is always teleologically oriented. It's always oriented towards goodness. We always choose things based on good, which kind of goes to the objection that you started to talk about, that if we know God fully, we will always choose him because we always want maximum goodness, and God is maximum goodness. So in choosing, certain things over another, what we are doing is we're cultivating in ourselves goodness, right? So the whole point in Christian theology for free will is ultimately to become full beings, and that actually, that sort of exercise, this fulfillment of our being, becoming all that we can be by participation in God, actually opens up libertarian free will, not in a sense of growing in being, but it's your absolute choice in our relationship with God. But certain things are set, which is why you can't leave heaven. Right? Becoming the most virtuous person possible, everything will look distasteful to you. As you cultivate that virtue and develop in your being, when you reach that sort of end, that goal that God is working in you, everything becomes... And you talk about this as well. I think you use a fire analogy, your quote scripture with a fire analogy. So I think we actually share a lot of that in common.
Yeah. So I did have some responses, though. So you said free will is not meaningful if the path is deterministic.
Yeah.
And that sort of seems to indicate that there can't be a scope for an objective highest good, because if having an objective highest good means that there is something that reigns supreme above everything else, and so I guess if there's the option that there are multiple paths that people can choose, that sort of seems to connote that's sort of contradictory to the idea that there is one supreme highest good for all souls. So I guess I would maybe respond also by saying that that's a good point, that if all souls come back to God, then the path is kind of deterministic, and that all souls will eventually come back to God. They never had the choice to do otherwise. But I think you can still have I guess you can still have souls coming to God and it still make free will meaningful, because I guess you can get into what makes free will meaningful, but I would argue that the path may be deterministic. There may be the highest good for the soul, but what makes free will meaningful is that the soul always has the choice to leave that behind and choose something else. They always have that. Even when they're with God, they have the choice to leave him and do something else. So that free will is always there. It's just through their own accord they choose God, even though they have these other options available to them. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like, it's, in one sense, it's deterministic in the sense that there is something that's so amazing that everything else is pale in comparison. But I would argue that it's even though there's this one amazing thing that's everything's pale in comparison, and all souls eventually do come back to it. There's free will still made meaningful because you have the option to choose otherwise, and the fact that you can choose otherwise makes your choice to be with God even more meaningful, because you're choosing to be with God even though you have all these options available to you. And then,
go ahead.
Okay, and then what you describe is that the soul's becoming progressively averse to God as kind of a second nature, kind of suggests a sort of fatalism that almost seems to be contrary to libertarian free will, because it sort of seems to suggest that at a certain point, the soul will just be so averse by its own nature that it has no capacity to change itself. And beyond just the soul's own capacity to change itself, it also seems to imply that there's no capacity for God's grace to allow that soul to rewire and change their habits. Whereas in the Hare Krishna view, there's a similar phenomenon that the soul can progressively go down, but because God's grace is so powerful, if the soul at any point decides to turn to God, and it always has the choice to turn to God, then God's just calling out to God is so powerful that it can sort of eradicate those tendencies, and the soul can redirect itself back upwards to God.
The prison analogy might help explain that a bit better too. Like, a prison run by a conditioned soul has an extremely high recidivism rate, which means that people, once they get out of jail, generally go back. That the being in the prison hasn't reformed their character. But on the Vaishnava view, the material world is like a prison for rebellious souls with the aim of correcting our mentality and ultimately elevating us in love of God. And when God sets up a prison, the recidivism rate is not so high. That it eventually serves its purpose of purifying our heart, and our rebellious mentality is corrected. Our perverted desires are purified.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. So there's 2 points I saw that you brought up. The first one is that free will can still be meaningful because we choose to that choice is still there. Correct. That choice that we still choose to, because there's a freedom to do it. To me, that seems to make the question I'm trying to bounce this off against is why not determinism, right? Why did God not create a deterministic system where people always stay with him? So why didn't he fully, and this sort of goes into another objection that we might have time for, with why didn't God so fully reveal himself to him, or fully reveal the evils, that this sort of evil was never a temptation, correct? Because that's eventually where we're going to be. And to me, that's always, we have to get back to the God creating in a place of virtue cultivation, that he had to create us in a state of ignorance. The problem I'm seeing with your view is that if everyone sort of ultimately ends up back with God, yes, you could still say that it's still good to choose, but it seems to make the very act of choice of rebellion against God a good in itself. But we would not want to say rebelling against God or choosing to leave God is good in itself. So why allow it? For me, it's a necessity of the very nature of what it means to create virtuous creatures. But for you, it seems like that the free will itself, sort of just by allowing that possibility, that you're allowing that freedom in those creatures, allowing that you make that choice itself a good thing, that they chose to rebel against God. And this also brings up the issue of, you say 90% stayed behind. Why create the other 10% then? Unless God fails in foreknowledge. So, and the third issue that I thought of with that is the system itself that they go through doesn't seem to promote their return to God in the best possible way. So, for instance, like between my lives, I have no memory of my past life. So why is my memory blanked out? If I knew what I was being punished for, perhaps I could return quickly. Why isn't there some sort of revelation, or why is memory sort of blanked out every 90 years between lives? The second point you brought up is grace sort of just seems to end in hell. So why does God's grace sort of get cut off at that point? And am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah.
Why does grace get cut off in hell? And I think that I don't think it does. I honestly don't think it does. But what you need to understand is grace is always on offer, and this is the capacity. Because I agree with you that the choice to pursue God is good, that a freely chosen good is good. But the ultimate goal of it is always transcendentally determined toward God Himself. So that ultimately we want to love God simply because it's who we are. It's not something we choose to do. It's just who we are. You know, a mother doesn't choose to love her child every day. You ask a mother to not love her child, and she could sooner do anything than stop loving her child. She doesn't feel like she has a choice in that. And so that's the sort of end goal that we have with God. Now, take that in with hell, right? And so if you're trajectorying towards God, eventually you don't have that choice. Now, if you're trajectory away from God, eventually you won't have that choice as well. You're developing habits, right? So grace is always on offer, but the question is not whether or not God's grace is offered. The question is whether we can receive God's grace. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, that was good. Let's see. So, it's not so much that this, to the first point, that the fall itself is a good thing. It's not necessarily good that the soul falls. It's just God so structures it that even though the soul makes this bad decision, that he can still be redeemed. And as to why these 10% fall, so to that I would say that, I guess God creates souls that are by and large rational, that they have, they by and large see that it's better to be with God. But it comes back to the point of how it's logically impossible to produce selves or souls that have no capacity to turn away from God. God could not, he couldn't just be like, okay, this soul's going to fall, I'm not going to make him, or because then, in order to have free will, souls to have free will, they have to have that capacity. And maybe not everyone will act on that capacity to leave God, but that capacity has to be there if it's to be truly a truly free relationship. Alvin Plantinga kind of defends this logically with transible depravity and all that kind of line of argumentation. But basically, I guess I would argue that it's maybe not that God doesn't have foreknowledge, but he knows that it's just a logical impossibility, like a square circle, to create souls, and none of them have the capacity to fall whatsoever. To make souls, to be able to make souls that have free will, there has to be that chance, that capacity that some souls will misuse their independence. And if there's enough souls that have this capacity, it may be inevitable that there's a small minority that do misuse it. But God could not create all souls without, God could not create souls with the capacity to misuse independence without some souls being able to misuse that.
Yeah.
But also another point to make would be that the kind of it would be a sort of eugenics to say let's not create any of the souls that would fall down, because those souls that fall down, they later get perfection, and that perfected state is a good which justifies all the suffering they went through and all the pain, and everything. Because it's like that old question: is it better to have lost and
but it would still be a superior world, right? It would still be a superior world, a world where no one ever fell than a world that did fall. And for God, who is perfectly good, the idea of him saying, I could choose to create a perfect world where no one ever has to suffer, a world where they do have to suffer, even though it's justified in the end.
Well,
I guess God can't actualize a world where no one falls, because a world where no one falls is a world where no one has free will. Because
again,
if you're in a world, it's basically God. It's logically impossible to actualize a world where no one falls, because in such a world, selves don't actually have free will. They're prevented from falling, and then they're like a soul has free will and is at the same time controlled by certain restrictions and parameters that it can't violate is not really free.
Well, also I think we could do a Vaishnava version of what I think is called supralapsarianism. The idea that Jesus suffering on the cross was such a good thing that it justifies all of the suffering that needed to happen in order for that to exist. So in a similar way, we can say that the good of taking these conditioned souls who fall into the material world and raising them up, like so many prophets have come and so many religions, and they elevate people in God consciousness, that there's a special kind of good that's there in this uplifting of other living entities, that if everybody was just perfect all the time, we couldn't have that kind of expression of compassion.
Yeah, and then, so as for your third point, this is where it starts to get interesting. So yeah, that whether this world that God creates, whether the version, karma is, whether karma is the best process for us to come back to God, is one that's been hotly debated. And you mentioned one argument, the memory argument. Karma is there. Why can't I remember things? There's actually a lot of other arguments. I do address the memory argument later, but the idea is that, one, I would challenge the idea that just because we don't have conscious remembrance of something doesn't mean we can't learn lessons. So, as one example, the experience of pain in general, I argue, has a teleological purpose because it makes us more sensitive to others by reference to our own pain. So if I punch someone, there's something wrong in my consciousness that caused me to punch someone. And if I get punched in return, that teaches me what that pain feels like, and I can learn from my own experience of that pain that it's, it makes me sensitive. It rewires my own psyche to be more sensitive. And, having been punched, I feel like, I don't want to punch someone else. So, even though we might not have conscious remembrance of some of the things we did, there are sort of other things we can do to sort of let that experience of pain serve a lesson for us. If I punch someone in the past life and I get punched in this life, I may not remember that, but I can sort of be introspective and realize that I have some violent tendencies, and it's possible that I did something based on these violent tendencies to harm someone, and now me getting punched is there to let me understand the repercussions of my violent actions.
So can I clarify just real quickly so I don't misunderstand you? Are you saying that like I might not remember, maybe I punched someone in the past life, I was just a jerk, but like now when I get tempted to do that I might not remember it, but there's somehow there is some sort of resonance that lingers with myself through lives?
Yeah, I think if you're introspective, you can realize that you have violent tendencies, and you may not remember that precise action, but you can at least, through introspection, realize that, okay, I have these violent tendencies. It's possible that I acted on these in a past life, and now I'm getting a reaction for it.
I guess the key point would be the mentality remains, and even though you can't remember what you did with that mentality, you still have the mentality that it has a tendency towards those actions. And then when you suffer the receiving end of that kind of mentality, you realize that that mentality is not a good thing to have, and you start weeding it out of your heart. Sometimes called cosmic sensitivity training. Like, it's often mentioned in psychology how people who have suffered, they have a great amount of compassion, and people who haven't suffered, they're less likely to have compassion. So.
Yeah, exactly. So... Yeah. Basically, it's not necessary that we remember something for something to serve a beneficial purpose. Just the experience of pain itself can make us more compassionate, whether we remember what we did or not.
Right. Did you have a point for the grace and health?
Yeah. So that's a good point. Whether we can receive grace, I would argue that, in one sense, the soul, through its own actions, can become progressively more godless and sort of reject the opportunity to come back to God. But in the Hare Krishna view, that's where the karmic mechanisms come into play. Mm-hmm. So just the fact that, these karmic mechanisms, the soul may be really reluctant to turn to God, but through these karmic reactions, it shapes the soul, and it's like soul making. It shapes the characters. It shapes the soul's character, and by repeatedly getting these karmic reactions, even if the soul is sort of averse to God, by getting these repeated lessons as it goes about lives, it can eventually start to rectify its faults and improve its moral character. So in that sense, I argue that there's no, the soul doesn't have to choose God. It always has that choice, and it may progressively be averse to God, but by gradually receiving these kind of karmic consequences, then it shapes the soul and makes it maybe the suffering makes it more attuned to God, or maybe it learns lessons, becomes more compassionate in one life. It learns about learns to control its anger in another life. It can, even if it doesn't come to God, through these karmic mechanisms, it can at least improve its character, moral character, and from there it can be in a better position to maybe be receptive in some other life.
Gotcha. Yeah, those are great points. I have 3 points back, if that's all right?
Yeah.
Number one, you mentioned talking about how, just if I can return to the idea of, is free will meaningful? Well, you say, well, you can be, because we ultimately will return to God eventually. And that choice itself, yes, it's all sort of transcendentally determined in the end, but that sort of indeterminacy of coming back doesn't give it meaning. To me, I still have to appeal to the mouse trap, or the mouse maze. It doesn't seem like it can be to me. If there's no real possibility of rejecting God, then the choice doesn't seem to be very meaningful. And maybe this just comes down to our affective reaction to it, because I don't feel that there's any meaning to it. To me, the one path makes a lot more sense than giving the mouse choice, but ultimately determining its path doesn't really add meaning to the maze. It doesn't add meaning to the choices of the mouse. The only way the mouse's choices have meaning is if it can fail, is if it cannot choose. That's what gives it meaning. That's what the fact that your spouse can leave you is what gives the marriage, the love covenant, so much meaning. Is they could always choose to leave, and they don't, and not choose to leave temporarily and come back, but literally refuse the offer. And to me, that's what makes refusing an offer really refusing an offer. It's not a not yet. It's a no. That's the difference between a no and not yet. And to me, your system has a not yet, but it doesn't have a true no, and that's what makes the choice no really meaningful. So that might just be more of a clarification of my point than anything. Number two, you talked about how weak the memory that, and I can gravitate towards the idea of there being a sort of, you having suffered in past lives can make you a better person. So there is a sort of resonance that goes through lives. It's not a sort of tabula rasa blank slate, right? So I think that's great, and I think that sort of softens the blow. I'm not sure if I can see it at fully removing the memory objection, because then if that just by acknowledging that answer as being helpful, you have to beg the further question of, why don't we have more? Why is the karmic system, and it seems to be a rule, right? It's not like there's a ton of people who remember past lives. If there are, they're highly exceptional. So I guess the question to me still remains is, why isn't there more of this? Even if there is this sort of the subtleness to it that sort of is non-empirical, that we could never truly detect, why isn't there more of this?
More of what precisely?
Oh, more memories, more of this sort of past lessons, these past sufferings from these lives, because that would improve me in my journey and my return quite a bit. And you had a point on grace. You pointed out with that in your system that there is a sort of, that's when karma kicks in and it prevents people from ever sort of removing themselves completely from the grace of God, which is a great system to me. But you also brought up earlier the idea of transworld depravity, transworld damnation. And this is where I might say perhaps there are worlds where no matter what karmic system is created, that God does, any chance that he has removing that, there are people that simply won't do that. That the domino, the sort of streams could never cross in a way where he could ever redeem everyone. To me, that's transworld damnation. And to me, as long as that's logically possible, the concept of hell makes sense.
Okay.
I really do like the idea of that karmic system. The question is, to me, is that a possibility for God? And to me, that we both have to probably just appeal to skeptical theism at this point.
Yeah. So with the first point, I guess that's what makes free will meaningful, whether it means you always have the choice to just say no, never, or whether it means, like in my view, that it means you have the choice to say no, but realistically you wouldn't. Yeah, I think that's maybe something you can't really, it's a point, agree to disagree point. What makes free will meaningful, I guess, that's in one sense a sort of subjective criterion. So I think in that case, it's maybe a agree to disagree, and we can kind of close that one. Okay. The memory, the more memory, I guess, why don't we have more? And one practical reason is that if we were bogged down with all our memories throughout all our infinite lives, that'd be extremely difficult and burdensome. If we remembered every single thing, even just within one memory, some people have really traumatic experiences that really prevent their, that can really be very damaging for their spiritual life. So imagine that for like all of existence. That would be extremely burdensome. So in one sense, the fact that we get these fresh starts lifetime to lifetime, it's like, it's nice to have these restarts, just like, even in this life, we might be working away on our dissertations, and then we take a break. We take a break from it a little bit, and we come back to
suffering.
It.
That's my first hell.
That's But we take a break from our PhDs, and then we come back to it, and that break gives us a new perspective. It lets us, keeps us fresh. It lets us see things from a different angle. It helps us in that process of what we're trying to do. So the fact that we have these births, that we don't have one long, elongated life, but we have a series of lives where we forget things, sort of gives us a fresh start, and I would argue it's more conducive for our spiritual progress. And then with the third point, you made an interesting point. As long as it's logically possible for there to be a hell, it can happen. I mean, I would argue that by that same token, as long as it's logically possible for there to be universal salvation can also happen. So I guess, yes, souls can be stubborn. They can choose to reject God, and they may take, eons and eons and eons. But, as long as there's the possibility of libertarian free will, it always has that choice to turn back to God. It may take eons, it may take eons and eons and eons. But the fact that it still has libertarian free will means that at any point, it can choose between X and Y. And if X is eternal damnation, then Y is God. And at any point, no matter how degraded it is, it can always have that choice still to turn back to God. So, I guess, it may take eons, but it's always a legitimate possibility that any soul can turn to God at some point. They may be very covered, and it may take them a long time. It may take, many, many eons of experiencing karmic suffering, and, maybe they're suffering and really versed to God, but then one life, something just sort of, one day they're just like, oh, I can't take it anymore. They're walking down, and they, they go to church, and they appreciate some good music or something. They're like, oh, this is kind of nice. Maybe I'd like a life kind of participating in this type of music, or, there's so many things that the soul can do in this world. All it takes is one sort of moment where it decides, maybe I could turn to God. And that's all it would take to sort of, bring him back on the path towards God. So I said to argue, as long as there's infinite time, and there's that possibility, no matter how small, I guess that possibility for universal salvation is always there. Because if there's infinite time, and, it's libertarian free will means that there is that possibility, however slight, that infinite time times however slight of a possibility ultimately, it'll work out.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So just to address those points, we can agree to disagree. And if you'd like, would you mind if I brought up an issue that we sort of touched on, we kind of stowed to the side? I'd really like to hear, you talked about we don't know God fully. Mm-hmm. In the sort of super mundane primordial state before the fall. And you claim that we never know God perfectly or fully or in that sense. Mm-hmm. I guess the question then becomes, so we don't know God fully, so we don't have perfect knowledge of all of our residential choices, which seems to undermine the point that we don't really know full residential choice. Does that make sense?
I guess what I mean by when I say we don't know God fully means we don't know God's, we don't know the extent of God's greatness. We don't know the extent of all his amazing attributes. And all we have to know is that God is a choice, and we can have a loving relationship with him. And that's available for the soul. That's all that the soul needs to know to be able to make that residential choice.
True, but you used the term God there. And I mean, if you understand what God is as the font of goodness, the infinite font of goodness, from which all other goodness is merely derivative, I think that sort of returns to the point of how could you possibly ever do so? Choose a way, and more so, how could you not ever fall away again out of curiosity? If you're curious the first time, what prevents curiosity the second time? And you mentioned the hand to the fire thing, but as long as there's libertarian free will, again, you could always reach back. It's however slight possibility, you could always reach back. And to me, that sort of makes sense, because there are sort of worldly sinful pleasures. Maybe if I had just committed adultery one more time, maybe if I just cheated one more person, and you can always ask that question. So there's always that curiosity. The curiosity, I don't feel like could ever be diminished. And one other point, just real quickly, you talked about that the logical possibility of universalism. I agree. I think that universalism is logically possible. The question is whether it's feasible for God to create. And that's how we sort of got into it's logically possible that there'd be God not, J.O. Mackey points this out, that there could be no evil. But that doesn't mean it's feasible for God to do it. In the same way, I'm making a very similar argument against universalism. Maybe it's not feasible. And that's why I said we ultimately have to go to skeptical theism, is we're not in a position, we're simply just not in a cognitive, an epistemic position to truly grasp that. That's just a sort of a quick rejoinder to that. But really, I'm curious what you have to say about that first point.
Yeah, I feel kind of bad because I feel like I'm going to return to that fire analogy, but there's another analogy. It's like, let's say you're with your parents. Yeah, you're with your parents and they're loving parents, and you decide, I can't stand with these people, and you run off, and then you run off into like some slum, and then you get stabbed. You get stabbed. You have to get hospitalized, and in that hospital bed, there's no air conditioning, and you're just like in this whole miserable condition. And you get so much pain that you're just like, oh my God, this is awful. I wish I'd realized how nice I was living with my parents. And then you do finally return to your parents. Having gone through this painful experience, it's so painful on such a level that it really teaches you, like, yes, I've fully realized now that it's my best interest to be with God. So there is always that chance to leave God, but it's, God is... it's amazingly blissful to be in His presence, and even though that chance is there, it's like there's a possible chance, but there's not a realistic chance, I guess, because
But there's infinite time, though, correct?
In one sense, yeah, there's infinite time, but I guess the difference that the kind of argument I use for universal salvation is that given infinite time, some souls will eventually be redeemed. I argue that the infinite time argument doesn't work for the soul falling back, because objectively speaking, the soul is happier and realizes that it's happier with God once it's back with God. So even though there's infinite time, the soul has the knowledge and it's realized that he's happier with God, and that's its objective happiness. Whereas for eternal damnation, it's not the soul's objective happiness to be there away from God. I guess it's to come back to that potato chip and the ice cream analogy. Like once you've tasted that ice cream, you realize it's better. You have knowledge that it's better, and even though you have the possibility to make other choices, 10 out of 10 times you wouldn't take it, even though you have the choice, because you've realized how good it is, and 10 times out of 10 you just naturally choose it. Because it's just what makes you happier.
Right. So here's the dilemma I'm struggling with right now. So either there is a possibility, and given a sort of infinite period of time, that possibility must be realized. So a similar argument you were making to me earlier, that if there's a non-zero probability, any non-zero probability given an infinite amount of time will always be actualized. So, but you have to have that freedom. So you have to maintain this possibility, because otherwise we aren't freely choosing to stay with God. Because if there is a 0% probability, now all of a sudden, as you defined free will earlier, it's a choice between X and Y. So we no longer have that choice to choose Y, to leave God. So do you see my dilemma here? Is if you return state? Okay, yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit tricky because probabilities is the way probabilities work out in abstract math sense is maybe different than how they play out in a real tangible sense. So it's like 9 times, like maybe there's a 1% probability that I decide it would just be better for me to douse myself and set myself on fire. Maybe there's a 1% chance that could happen. Even 1% is kind of high. In theory, there's a chance that I could always do it. In theory, but then in practice, I would never do that.
Right, I would actually, this is where I think you and I probably differ in how we define free will, because I would say that that's a 0% probability. So I'm pulling from Richard Taylor here, is free will only acts on desires, which is why, I give the illustration of not wanting to do a backflip right now. There's 0% desire for me to do that. Now that I speak of it, there's a slight desire. But there's a 0% desire normally to do that. Therefore, there's no chance that I'm going to do a backflip as much to your surprise as it is to mine. And so,
that's true. I think it might be a definitional thing, because I would argue that free will, it means that you have the potential to make other choices. And the potential to make other choices, I guess you can arguably say that you can have a potential to make another choice and have it be a 0% probability.
Right.
Maybe that's...
So, if that's true, then could God have given us free will with a 0% probability of us falling?
I guess in that case, he couldn't have, which does raise some interesting questions. But
because freedom is valuable because you can choose the alternative, right? But if there's a 0%, and we could still have free will, then God could have created a world that didn't fall, and yet we still have the valuable free will.
Yeah, I guess I guess the reason that the soul doesn't fall once it comes back is it's already made that choice, so it would never do it again. So I guess God can't actualize a world where no self ever will want to never fall, and still all selves would have free will. I guess God can't actualize a world where no selves would fall, because that would mean that selves don't really have free will. But he could actualize a world where those selves that do decide to fall have learned their lesson, and from that decide to never fall.
I'd say it'd be useful to draw a distinction between innocence and wisdom. So before we fall and we're innocent, but once we fall and return, we now have a wisdom which prevents us from making the same stupid mistake twice.
And I think I think we've moved pretty close actually to my theodicy, honestly. Because remember I said, I remember Adam and Eve are innocent, they're not morally perfect.
And
I drew that distinction. So I appreciate that, because I think the more we push each other, the closer we become. Honestly, it's quite odd.
We've got that real intention of reincarnation, and we feel like there's key things which can't be explained unless you bring in reincarnation.
Right. And I think what the same. If I can interpret the debate so far, it seems like the role reincarnation plays for you is the role that virtue plays in my system. If that seems to be the big gist.
I think you can. I mean, there's some disanalogous elements, but I think roughly speaking.
They're obviously disanalogous, but the sort of role that they play, especially like how can we fall? How can we be in a pristine state, fall, and what cultivates us back is the experience of wisdom. So that wisdom is a virtue. So there is a role of virtue for you in that. But the karmic system is the system through which it's done. Whereas in Christianity, it's in the life, it's in communion with God, the virtue development that does it. So karma plays a role that virtue development in the communion with God and within the church does in the Christian life. So go ahead.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've been asking a lot of the questions too. Do you have any questions for me?
That's a good point. Did we ever get to I think we got to the point on natural evil.
Yeah, I think it serves a very similar role. Although for you, it seems like it's more grounded on the individual. Like for instance, if a tree fell in the forest and landed on you, that would be sort of karmic justice, or in some way that's going to be that would have ultimate good in your particular life. And if I were to ask what, you would say, I don't know, skeptical theism, right? We can't know. You're not in an epistemic position. Whereas for me, it's the tree fell in the forest and you died. I would say that it would have some good. So it's a bit more generic. That there still is a sort of determination of this evil act for good.
Yeah.
And then I would juke to skeptical theism.
Yeah. I guess one thing, so in your Theodicy, is there several lives, or is there one life?
It is, to quote Hebrews, it is appointed for all men to die once and then face judgment.
So what makes a system where there's one life superior to one where souls have multiple chances of learning these lessons? Why couldn't someone just reincarnate as a human and learn lessons that would make them accept Christ's offer of salvation?
The reincarnation system?
Yeah.
Why is there a reincarnation system?
Yeah.
Because I don't think identity works that way, but I actually thought about bringing this up, but I didn't want to get into really difficult metaphysical issues.
Probably reincarnation would be like a whole nother debate.
It would be, and that's why I actually, like, you talked about other problems with, like, the karmic, and one of them I was thinking was, well, we have different views of what identity is, whereas yours, it seems, I don't want to call it a substance dualism, but it's much more of a divergence of the self from the embodied state than I feel comfortable with as a Christian. But again, that's a complete metaphysical
Why don't we
distinction.
just stick to the explanatory power of the different theologies in terms of the problem of evil, and leave the metaphysics aside for another discussion.
Right, okay. Absolutely. But on a different issue, you did bring up the point, and maybe I can return to this. You brought up the point of why certain people, the poor and the rich, right? And my point back to that is within the ultimate scope of things. Christ many times says, blessed are the poor. In Luke, he says, blessed are the poor. That there is an elevation of the poor, of the people of this life, because and I'll actually pull a point from you, that it is the suffering that allows us to cultivate virtue. So I'm kind of pulling a card from your deck, that the karmic system developing virtue.
I guess, I guess that argument doesn't really address the problem, but it just flips the role of the rich and the poor. So now the rich, why then? I think you even mentioned this earlier.
I did.
Why are the rich? Why does God put people in certain circumstances where it's just going to be less conducive for their?
I think generically, why are some people more privileged than others in the overall system? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is ultimately, within the Christian system, this ultimately comes down to the narrative. Christianity is very narrative driven. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it sounds like your system is as well. And people are actors within the narrative. And you can't have everyone sort of having the same role. What makes the narrative work, what allows it to go forward, is the interaction of the characters. And because of that, in order for God, and from my understanding, for God to have this sort of enacted narrative where people can even encounter, there's going to be, just logically, there has to be people who are more privileged than others. There's going to be people who are born in places where the gospel is preached, where there's going to be people who are born where it's not preached. I think this all measures in, because in Luke chapter 12 it talks about those who do not know will be beaten with less straps than those who did know. So obviously there's a fairness to this. There's even been an argument that the people who don't ever hear the gospel, they were prevented from hearing it lest they reject it and be punished all the more for having rejected ultimate goodness and telling God no. There's definitely an argument there, and that helps solve the problem of the unevangelized. But that goes to your point of why are some people more privileged than not? We're part of it. We're part of an enacted story, and the pieces all have to fall into place for any of it all to make sense. So maybe it's just not logically possible for everyone to have equal privilege. Some people will be there when the gospel is proclaimed. Some people will not be.
How do you feel about
Does that
the program solution for the problem of the unevangelized, which is that at the time of death they hear the gospel and they can decide to accept it and go to heaven instantly?
I have heard this. There's nothing in Scripture.
That was my question. Nobody's ever offered me any verses for it.
No, there's nothing to sort of there's nothing that sort of goes toward it that you can pull from
Scripture. Because I have philosophical issues with that. If someone lives their whole life, and then right at the end of it they get one instant where they hear the gospel, and that's the moment that decides perfection, what was the point of their life?
Yeah, I could still say there's a point, but to add to what you're saying, though, I really think it would also cheapen the role of the church, right? God has appointed humans on earth to be co-regents, to bring this message, and that's sort of the primary task, is the evangelism and bringing of the good news to the world. But if God's just going to do that all on its own anyway, then what's the point of us doing it,
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can see it. I mean, it solves certain issues, but at the same time, it also creates certain issues. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess how is so you mentioned different roles, but I guess in a play people generally choose the roles. I mean, maybe not in all cases, but there can be cases where players get to choose their roles. But if people are thrust into roles that they didn't choose, and those roles involve more suffering, then it seems impartial for God to thrust more suffering onto certain souls than to others. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a system of karma, according to a karmic conception, souls choose their own destiny, so they're never unfairly thrusted with suffering that they didn't freely choose.
Right. And here's the problem. As soon as the idea of God creating us and then giving us a choice whether to participate, you're already part of the narrative as soon as you do that. Right? Mm-hmm. Because the play, to bring the analogy back down to earth, the play is creation. So for God to create someone and say, do you want this role? They're already serving a role because they're part of creation. Mm-hmm. So there's no backing out of the play. If you're in creation, you're part of the play. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
We have an analogy that's commonly used, which is you use your free will to get on an airplane. Once you're on the airplane, you're determined. Certain things are no longer a choice. You have to ride that flight until you arrive at your destination. Once you're on the airplane, you can make certain choices. So that sort of relates to what you're saying in terms of you choose to enter the play.
Yeah, and that's sort of yeah, because I can see that in the karmic system, because you choose whether to get on the airplane or not, and that's sort of the choice between to leave God or not to leave God, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and also on a smaller scale, like if you choose to do something in this life, then in your next life something happens to you as a consequence. That's something that's a sequence of actions which was created by a previous action you did, which takes away some of your free will, just like getting on a plane takes away some of your free will.
Yeah, and the disanalogy there is no sort of, because you can sort of get behind that riding the plane to the choice itself, right? But the analogy I'm drawing is there's no getting behind the play in this sense, right? The play is all creation, all choice, all people. You can't stand outside of that and still be a created being. So you have to be a part of the play. There's no choice to be in or out of the play. As soon as you're in the play, you're in the play. Right. Mm-hmm. Once the play exists, you are in it. Does that make sense? I know we're pushing this analogy pretty far.
So I guess the difference.
Are you using that to explain, say, children born with cancer or something?
Yes. So I wouldn't dare bring that up because of the whole emotional problem of evil without going back
cancer, to. This is not the conversation you have with them, obviously.
No, it isn't. Which is why I would always juke back to Christ and the idea of meaning and suffering, right? Because the play itself, every character has a meaning, has a purpose. And so maybe this is, to go back to this exhausted analogy, every point of it, you think of like a mosaic, or have you seen those pictures where it's like they take people's little faces and they construct a larger face out of it? Mm-hmm. The Christian narrative is every person's face is that. And the overall construction is the face of Christ, which is the ultimate meaning of the universe. Mm-hmm. And so everyone ultimately plays a role, even in their suffering. So suffering always has meaning. And to me, that's what prevents suffering from becoming evil, is the fact that meaning. And then I return to my childbirth analogy.
Mm-hmm. I guess, so we're similar in that as soon as you come to this world, you have to, you're in the play. The difference with karma is that you're in the play, but you get to choose your role. Whereas without karma, you're in the play and that's how it is, but you don't get to really choose your role. Right. So I guess how is not being able to choose your role more superior than a worldview where you are able to choose your role?
Right. And the question, it's not necessarily for me. a question of superiority. The question is a possibility and a feasibility, right? Is it feasible, or is it overall better in that system that you get to choose your role? And to me, I'm going to pull back to our common shared humanity, that our responsibility is for one, that the overall story itself has ultimate meaning because of cooperation. So you talk about, I brought up Richard Swinburne pretty derogatorily earlier, but he brings the point that the fact that there are, some people who are more privileged and people who are less privileged, that allows for the possibility of charity. Charity could not exist outside of that. And that overall makes the play a better play. Now, there are, of course, evil actions done and all that sort of stuff, which I would appeal to other parts of it. But I would also say that the narrative itself is built up. Courage, the virtue of courage would not exist if there was nothing to be courageous against, if there wasn't something to stand up to.
So, you can have that and add into it this layer that the people are suffering because of earning it or deserving it as a consequence of actions they did to get themselves there. Like Alvin Plantinga gives the famous solution for the problem of evil based on free will, that because there's free will, these things are going to happen, and it's just part of the baggage. It just goes along with it. It can't be avoided. But that falls short, because superior to a world where somebody can freely choose to punch somebody in the face is a world where somebody can only freely choose to punch somebody in the face who has the karma to deserve that action to be done to them, who has themselves done something similar to somebody else and needs that experience in order to teach them compassion.
And here's the issue, right? Because you still want to say that person freely chose to punch that person in the face, right? Right. But again, we can't say God can control all free will action. So if God can set up, you've got a system that's so complex that God can set up that no person is ever punched in the face without ever having deserved it, right? But he can't stop 10% of a whole 10% and billions of people from falling. So the system seems so wonderfully aligned that it can allow for there never to be one injustice that wasn't karmically sort of set up, but it can't prevent a large, billions from actually making that same free will decision to fall, which sort of seems inimical to God's overall plan.
I'd say...
Does that make sense?
I get that.
So it seems like in one system, the system is very complete. There's, it's like a very airtight system. No person's ever punched without having deserved it. And how can you also say that there was a vast majority that fell?
I'd say two things.
I guess it's
one is you can choose an action, but then be delayed in being able to actuate it. So someone's decided they want to do something, but then they're not able to do it at the time, and so God arranges that they can only do it at the time when it's the opportunity to do it for somebody whose karma it is. But I'd also say that we have a karma to be around certain people, and once we're around those people, then their free will can push and pull on us a little bit. I might say my children have the karma to be my kid, but I could go downhill as a parent, or I could improve as a parent, and that could be over and above their karma or below their karma, perhaps. What do you think, Ādi?
So karma is not completely, it's not a complete system. So there is a possibility that you can improve. Like let's say your children might deserve, I don't want to say that. Your children might deserve something, but you, because of your sort of karma, you can prevent that from occurring, correct? So you can improve your karma for them. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, well, what I'd be saying there is the karma is to be around a certain mentality of person. But that person can sort of push and pull a little bit within that. Would you agree, Ādi?
Yeah. Well, I guess I actually want to come back to one of the original points. So God can actualize this really complex karmic system, but he can't actualize the 10%. I would say that the karmic systems is basically, it's a system where every soul gets their due results. And it's not a logical impossibility to create a system where people get their rewards. I would say that that's conceptually actually much easier than a system where, you're creating this world where people have free will, but they can't misuse it. Creating a world where no souls fall is a logical impossibility. Creating a world where people get the results of their activities is not a logical impossibility. It's very complex, but it's not a logical possibility.
You're right.
And also, with that karmic system, there's sort of this assumption that it's this close... there's still scope for free will in the karmic system, too. The main point is that God doesn't override our free will, and by creating this system where there's karmic mechanisms that account for everything, he's not negating free will by creating this system. Sort of Arjuna was mentioning, he basically makes it so that every action has a consequence. But within that system that every action has a consequence, people still have free will. Something can happen to them. They have a choice on how they respond to that. So the karma doesn't necessarily negate our ability to respond to our choice, our reactions.
Yeah, okay. So I wouldn't say it negates the free will, and I guess that wasn't ever my argument. My point was that the system is sort of set up in a very middle knowledge-esque way, where no one ever gets punched. No one is ever in a position where they are punched unless their karma had prior deserved that. That takes a sort of orchestrating of the universe to a minuscule level, right? That there is never any sort of undeserved punishing.
It's definitely incredibly complex and sophisticated thing to orchestrate.
Incredibly complex,
no
right?
Question.
But to speak that out one side of your mouth, and of course it's logically possible, but then again, so is a perfect universe. And that was J.L. Mackey's point. And even the rebuttal to that didn't say it was logically impossible, but that it might be feasibly impossible given the nature of free will. So I guess my reply back to them is it doesn't seem like that can compute well with a 10% fall. If God can create a system of dominoes falling to where no domino ever fell out of place within the mundane world, why doesn't he have any sort of even close analogous control in the super mundane world?
I guess it comes down to you can't really control a self. You can't control a self to where they or a soul to where they just can't misuse their free will.
Right, but then how does that not play into the mundane world where people might get punched undeservedly? So that's the sort of juggle that I'm feeling right now, is how do you juggle that?
Juggle. I guess so. The question is, how could God basically not prevent these 10% of souls from falling?
Not necessarily. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's not necessarily that, because I think you very rightly point to free will and the incapacity to control free will in all circumstances and all situations. Because earlier in the debate, I asked why didn't he stop at 10%, and you said certain circumstances, freedom, there's that possibility, and so that 10% is still a significant portion. It's billions of souls, and yet God is exercising a level of control here in the mundane world that's completely disanalogous of making sure evil is never, ever done to the undeserved.
I guess it's, in one sense, a level of control, but in one sense, it's like a law. Like the law of karma. It's, I guess, to me, those are disanalogous points that the law of karma, like a universe structured by certain reciprocal, like karmic mechanisms versus a universe where souls just can't fall together. I guess in the case of souls falling, the difficulty lies in preventing souls from basically, the difficulty is that you can't coerce souls into not doing something while giving them free will. That's the difficulty there. The difficulty in creating a world where souls have every single action has a consequence. It doesn't require. It's very complex, yes, but it doesn't. In one sense, it's not. It's exceedingly complex, but it never takes away a soul's free will. So in that sense, it's never a logical impossibility.
Right, but neither is the idea that no soul ever freely chooses to leave God. I mean, we could always imagine the soul. We can imagine the souls all always choosing to stay with God, even while having the possibility to not do that. So the logical possibility kind of cuts both ways here. So the person who punched the person who deserved, they had the freedom to not do that, and yet God so orchestrated that it didn't happen. That it never happened. And the billions and trillions and quadrillions of times it happened. So God has a 100% success rate there, but he only has a 90% success rate Yeah, I guess and you point to a law, but I guess I'm curious, like a law of karma, why couldn't there be a similar law that orchestrated heaven to where its souls always freely chose to go with God? Anytime they might be tempted to or curious about that, there was some law that brought them back, and yet didn't interfere with their free will in the same way that the law of karma doesn't interfere with our free will.
I guess, yeah, there's like a, I guess I don't know, I find myself repeating the same point.
I'm sorry.
With the souls falling, the difficulty is that, God, basically it's, you can't not coerce souls to do what they want in that sense. You can't stop a soul from acting on its desire. That's kind of the bottom line. The soul has a desire, and God creates or produces the soul with that particular desire because it's a necessity for it to also love God. It has to have that desire to leave God in order to have the desire to freely choose God in a loving capacity. So, whereas with karma, why doesn't God arrange or make it so that selves can just have things happen to them against their free will? They get punched and it wasn't their karma to get punched.
I'm wondering how many of these questions don't cut both ways. Like,
and they may.
Yeah.
And feel free to quaque me, say you also have a problem with this,
Well, I'd say that the souls being able to just remain in perfection and never leave it and never choose anything else, that same question could be asked of the Christian Theodicy.
Right, which is why I appeal to virtue quite often. The idea that freedom, and I use the bicycle analogy, that ultimately the choice, there is a sort of solidification by once we know God and love God and see God for who he truly is, that sort of solidifies our virtue for him. To know God in his infinite goodness is to know that everything else only is good because of him. And so you can only desire other things through God in that sense, if that makes sense. Everything else is just sort of my tiny mirror, mirroring God. And once you see the true image, you'll never desire the mirror again because that's not the real thing. So there is a sort of solidification of the will there. And that's why I also drew the analogy of a mother. We consider that a sort of pure form of love, a love that is no longer chosen, but it's part of her nature. She couldn't choose not to do it. And that's the sort of end, the telos, the goal of our love with God, is it's a love not chosen. That now we have the choice to accept or reject. But as we make that choice, it becomes us.
I guess, we did kind of mention that the similar thing happens in the Hare Krishna framework, where the soul, through, you say virtue, we would sort of say maybe learning its lessons. I don't know what the equivalent would be, but there's a sort of virtue equivalent where the soul does sort of learn that its highest good is to be with God. And maybe I guess I like Arjun's point of the delayed actualization. God can make it so that souls never leave, in one sense, because the souls ultimately come back, so no one leaves permanently. But why souls have to go through this kind of painstaking process, I would argue that, it's the soul just, in order to, it wants to explore its choices, and it's the genuine choice that, as I mentioned, can go away from God. But what's, God is so merciful that he may not be able to produce a soul that can out of innocence. God can't produce a soul that out of innocence wouldn't leave him. But he can produce a soul that can learn lessons through being in this world. That he can produce a soul that can learn the lessons and never leave him.
Gotcha. Yep.
Another analogy that might be useful is different. What Prabhupada talks about different types of intelligence. First class intelligence, they receive good instruction, and let's say that you tell the child, "Don't touch the fire, you'll get burnt." First class intelligence, they hear once and they learn the lesson. Second class intelligence, they watch somebody else get burnt, and then they think, "Okay, I better not do what they did. I don't want to get burnt." So they hear the instruction, they see it, and then they think, "Okay," then they learn the lesson. third class intelligence, they themselves burn their hand. And then they learn the lesson. And then 10th class intelligence, they burn their hand repeatedly, almost to infinity. And then eventually they learn, okay, fire burns, let me not do this. So it's a soul choosing to leave. It's kind of like that. It's like most people actually don't choose to leave. Most souls are intelligent enough to remain. But, so is it logically possible for God to create souls, give them free will, and have them all be first class intelligence and not just, it's a bit like you'd be taking away of kind of free will that they could choose to not listen to good instruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I can switch topics, because I think we're completely in agreement on that. That to me is just that's just virtue, right? You learn the fire in virtue of having done that. There's an etymological similarity there that I think it's really getting at a theodicy I think we share. I would like to get back to the idea of what place do you see, and this is just more of a general question, and it's not an objection, but me as a Christian, what place do you see for grace in your system? The idea of unmerited favor on God's part, because everything seems earned. Yeah, what place is there for grace?
Yeah. So the merit is that God reciprocates with you. The grace is that you get far more than what you deserve. So, let's say I call out God's name, I call out Krishna. That's our name for God. The merit is that Krishna reciprocates with my devotion. I do something and God does something in return. So in one sense, there's merit. But the grace is that, I just do a little simple act. And by me calling out Krishna, Krishna does so much more for me. I just do a simple act calling out Krishna, but Krishna, takes me into his lap and takes care of me like a child and really... we have a saying, you take one step towards God, Krishna, he takes 10 steps towards you. So the fact that God is, the one step that you take and God's taking steps in response to that is merit. But those extra 9 steps is grace.
Okay. In that sense, there's actually an analog to be drawn between you and Catholic theology. Do you see the one difference, and this is where I might ask, is in the Christian system, both Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, that first step is always, even that first step is enabled by God himself. Is that a difference between us, or would you agree that grace itself, that unmerited favor, even in the very possibility of approaching God, comes from God?
Yeah, we would agree in this. Well, our view is interesting. So God's grace comes through his devotees. Great figures throughout the years, or just devotees in general. And the way that God's grace comes to people is the God's devotees, they make friends with other devotees, they show mercy to the innocent, and they avoid those who are envious. So if someone's innocent, one will get the mercy of God through a devotee in some capacity.
Yeah.
So the grace is always there. The grace comes first in one sense, because the grace is through the devotees, and the devotees are always willing to share the grace, and God will even send devotees down to send that grace. So the grace, in one sense, comes first, because it's always there and it's being freely distributed. But in one sense, so that's there, but the merit comes from the fact that we have to be receptive to it. So God's grace is first, but in one sense, our own willingness to receive it also has to be there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. Yes, your own willingness. So there still is we might say an active principle, an active power that you contribute to the good act. Would say that? Okay, that might be a slight difference between the Christian. Yeah. It is slight. So in Christianity, that's known as synergism as opposed to monergism. And most Christians, not all, are monergists. They think that even that enabling power is God himself working in you. And the human agent my free agency is to step aside and allow God to do that. I have the ability, my only contribution to the salvation is the sin that made it possible and me allowing God to do it. So I could always resist God. I could only ever resist God. But then this brings up a further question, which is if you're contributing to it, if I can return to my question of forgiveness, right? Is in some sense, are you contributing to forgiveness?
It's sort of like God is, in one sense, already forgiven, because the fact that he's allowing his grace to be shared in the first place is a sign that he's forgiven us. Yeah, so in one sense, we're not really contributing. God's already forgiven, but our contribution comes in maybe taking hold of God's forgiveness.
Gotcha. So in a sense, if I can push this just a bit, you do see us as contributing to forgiveness.
God's forgiveness and his willingness to have us come back to him is not something that we contribute to in the sense of, God's always willing to forgive us and take us back. Mm-hmm. Where our effort lies is being able to accept God's offer of grace that he's already made. You can in one sense say as soon as we left God, he forgave us and wanted us back. His compassion is unending, so anything less would be, not suited to the nature of God. So his forgiveness and willing to take us back is, I guess, happens first. And like I mentioned before, our contribution only comes in the sense that God's forgiven us already, and now we're finally taking him up on that kind of offer more fully.
In that sense, say I punched someone in a past life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does any sort of evil the karmic system seems like a law, though, that somebody must sort of punch me back. I mean, I know this is crude, but
the way we talk, as karma is talked about in the Bhagavatam and so on, is that the karma is there, but if you change your mentality without coming to God, the karma still plays out, because it's like the laws of material nature, just like a law of physics plays out.
Okay.
But if you come to God and change your mentality, then God may take that karma away, or he may use a karmic pattern that you have anyway to teach you other lessons.
So, yeah, there is what in coming to God. What does that mean in the system?
It means play out of your own accord. You do an act of devotion. So chanting God's name. That's what we're known as the Hare Krishnas. We chant God's name. That's one of our main spiritual practices. But, serving a devotee of God, reading scripture, dedicating one's life to God, even dedicating one's money to God, anything done with an act of devotion towards God.
I think what I've been trying to push towards is that truly, I'm coming at this from a Christian perspective, but is that truly forgiveness then? Is if you have to in some way, there's a meritorious action given, right? So in Christian theology, you have been forgiven. Christ died for the sins of the world. And John 16 makes clear that the only sin you're ever indicted for is how do you respond to Jesus. The since they now stand condemned because they did not accept him. It's the only sin listed. The only sin that you were indicted for is what did you do with Christ? Because you stand forgiven. Always already forgiven in the Christian system, and that to me that spells forgiveness. To me, that's what forgiveness is, and that to me seems like a superior idea of forgiveness for God, is that you don't have to sort of merit it in some. Even in a small way, even at that one step is not even there. You don't even need to take the one step. God has taken 100 steps to you, and you merely have to stand there and receive him. Yeah.
Well, even in a Christian context, you can say that you can't really shy away from taking that step, because that you at least have to take the step of accepting Christ's offer of salvation.
Yeah, and this is where I brought up monergism, and I sort of flew by. The idea of accepting, we don't think of that as an active thing we contribute, right? We think about that. Imagine the analogy, the classic analogy is, imagine the city gates that are opened, and you're a guard, and a city's army is coming in. If you do absolutely nothing, they're going to take over. The only action, if you do action, actually contribute to something, it would be to close the gate and to prevent them from coming in. And you should think about it, salvation the same way. You, by doing nothing, is what allows God to come in. Your only active power that you can contribute is to refuse God. So even in the act of acceptance, it's always God acting, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and that's what makes forgiveness so radical in the Christian idea, is the pure passivity of humans in it. And to me, that feels like a superior form, is that you're not having to earn this forgiveness anyway. And forgiveness, to me, it seems like it's unearned. It's completely unmerited. It's not partially unmerited. It's completely unmerited.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess.
I know we've branched into soteriology, but I think it all connects.
Yeah. I guess in one sense that the army coming in and you being the guard, that's continually going on within our Hare Krishna context. I mean, God is basically at every moment wanting us to come back. I guess what makes the distinction is that we sort of have to voluntarily accept that to a greater extent than in Christian context. And I guess that's, in one sense, I guess that's maybe where notions of free will come into play. Maybe depends on how you conceptualize free will. I guess, to go back to God, the soul has to really want to go back to God. So, I don't know, I don't think it's necessarily, I think God's willingness to forgive is unlimited and it's always there. But God can't force us to come back to Him unless we have our own will to do so. If that will is there, it's God's willing to take us back, but He can't force us against our will to accept an offer.
Right, and I would agree with that.
I think we look at it in terms of more like the state of consciousness. So that you need to have a certain mentality in order to actually go back to Godhead. And if you don't have that mentality, then you won't fit in there and you won't even be happy. And,
that's a point. Yeah, that's a point. Like, let's say we were to be with God. If we still on some level wanted to be the center, or we still had some, personal selfish desires we had, we wouldn't be happy with God and His kingdom.
Right.
If we wanted to go to Disney World or something, and we were in the spiritual world with God, we wouldn't be happy ourselves. So it has to be a wholehearted, it has to be a wholehearted desire from within ourselves to really be there ourselves. Even if God extends His hand out and drags us, if we have other desires or we have other intentions, then even if personally drags us to His kingdom, what guarantees that we'd be happy?
Yeah, there's a logical problem also that I'm deriving from this, which is God is the font of all goodness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I somehow actively contribute from my own will in that action, if I'm somehow a source of energy, to use the old Christian term, apart from God, then I am contributing a source of goodness that's independent of God. So that's why I'm really stressing hardcore that even the very goodness that we have is merely God acting in and through us, to use that Christian language. Yeah, because that's just a logical outcome for you.
Yeah, well, in the Gita, Krishna says He's the ability in man. So you could argue that the goodness we have is actually a part of God's goodness itself. The goodness we have only is there because God has given it to us, and our goodness is not distinct from God's goodness in the sense that He has enabled us to have the goodness to begin with. So maybe that's one perspective. Another perspective is maybe that if we're in a dark well, God has extended out a rope, and His infinite goodness is that the rope pulling us out. It's completely His goodness. Whether it's an extrinsic form of goodness for us to just grab onto that rope, I would say that it's maybe not so much of an act of goodness to hold on to that rope, which brings us out of that well, but to sort of our own free will. The goodness isn't the rope. Our own endeavor is just simply an acceptance of that goodness.
I think our ontology is a little bit different too. Like we talk about the soul. The soul is described in Bhagavad Gita as being part and parcel of God. So we've got the same quality of God, but just a minute quantity. So like you take a drop of water from the ocean and it's salty. It's the same quality of the ocean, but it's different in quantity. You can't use a drop of water for what you could use an ocean for. You need God, but we have a minute quantity, and so we do have some goodness in the sense that we are a small expression of God ourselves. And also, I think that there is kind of a logical problem with it too. That sorry, I lost my train of thought. I don't remember what point I was going to make.
Well, while you're thinking that, I will say that is, there are Christians, so there's actually a big divide within Christian theology, which one you might be privy to, between the personalists, the theistic personalists, and the classical theists. Have you heard this distinction?
No, actually.
Not so much.
Yeah, it's so I've been arguing from a very classical theist perspective with bits of theistic personalism thrown in, so I'm a self-contradiction in that sense. But the idea that you've expressed is closer to theistic personalism. This idea that, yeah, God creates us, but we're sort of our own little packets of good. Like you take a cup of water from the ocean, and it sort of exists on its own. Whereas classical theism, that's sort of what you read throughout most of the tradition, is this idea of, yeah, you can take a cup of water, and you have that cup of water, but it never really leaves the ocean. So you can sort of talk about the cup of water on itself. Maybe it's like you set it to where the rim sort of is on top of the ocean, but it always is a part of that greater ocean of goodness. So that cup of water is always sort of within and receives from that ocean everything that it is, if that makes sense. And that's a very vague and difficult way of describing how goodness is received. But within a classical theist tradition, there's a doctrine called participation, which is we exist only by participation in God. Our very being is sort of derived from God himself, not sort of independently, but sort of like the rays of a sun shining out. So that's why I've been stressing so hard this idea of grace, forgiveness, and goodness being completely and only in God. Because if we think about God as the font of all goodness, then we can't then say that we somehow do goods independent of God.
So I just think the point I was going to make is I think if there's a logical problem with it too. Like if you lower the rope down to the well, is it possible to pull somebody out of the well without them needing to hold on? This is sort of I've heard Christian apologists say this is a unique thing to Christianity, where they say it's all grace. But actually, if you look throughout the world religions, you'll see that in many traditions, you'll find some people in the camp that it's all grace. And the analogy that's given, are we like the baby monkey who has to hold on to the back of the monkey while she swings through the trees, and if she falls off, the baby monkey dies sometimes? Or are we like the kitten who gets carried in the mouth of the mother kitten, of the mother cat? And our Vaishnava Siddhanta states that it's a mixture of the two, that it's God's mercy, but it's also our effort. And I think to say that it's all grace raises a logical problem. If it's nothing but grace, why doesn't just everybody get saved by fiat, by divine fiat? So there's something we need to do to position ourselves to receive the mercy. Like sometimes Prabhupada would say, the rain even falls on the ocean. The ocean doesn't need the mercy. In a similar way, God makes his mercy available to everybody, but only some people take it. And like, if somebody's got a drug habit, you can throw endless amounts of money at them, giving them rehab and trying to support them. But if that person doesn't make an effort themselves, there's no way they can be cured of their problem. And I think it would be something similar with God. But if God could just throw money at us, or throw his divine fiat at us and make us perfect, then why wouldn't he do it? It must be a logical impossibility, and actually, our internal effort is also necessary. And
I think that's the point I wanted to drive home with the analogy of the gatekeeper and the gate, right? So the dichotomy that you brought up is the idea of, if it's all God, why isn't everyone saved? Versus we have to contribute something, some sort of goodness that sort of sprouts from our own being. If I am to sort of logically allow the possibility of God's rejection. But the point of the gatekeeper analogy is the idea that libertarian freedom can still hold true, because it's just a choice. And the choice doesn't have to be an act of principle. If I've been choosing to remain seated this whole time, but I haven't actually contributed any active energy to that, right? In the same way, the gatekeeper doesn't contribute anything to the armies marching in. So in the same way, when we receive God's salvation, it's completely an act of God. The only active choice we can make, rather than a passive choice, is to resist the will of God. And that's why not everyone can be saved, is some people do choose that. They choose to reject God's offer of grace. So libertarian freedom is still preserved in this, but Christians can maintain, as we commonly say, sola deo gloria, all glory to God, glory to God alone.
So our idea of salvation is a little bit different from the Christian one in that a mentality needs to be cultivated. So if you reach a certain level of perfection in this lifetime and it's not enough for you to fit in heaven, then you'll take birth again and be given better opportunities than you had in this life to continue. So it's sort of like, to ground this in reality, say somebody becomes a Christian, but they have some kind of addiction to something which is very anti-Christian, like, let's say, a drug habit.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they need to give up their drug habit in order to be a better Christian. Or is there something analogous that you'd agree with?
Maybe I'm not understanding the question. I'm sorry, could you rephrase that? I'm not quite sure I got what you meant there.
Well, somebody could be living a lifestyle which is sinful in a way which dishonors God,
mm-hmm.
and when they want to come to God, they need to stop living a life that dishonors God.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever details that plays out may be different in certain different religions because of different ideas of what's moral, and like, for instance, we don't eat meat and so on. But there'll be some idea of these things dishonor God. To be a proper Christian, to actually come to God, you need to bring your behavior up a little bit. So, and that would require there's some amount of mercy that God purifies the heart, and that you come and you pray and you hear about God, and you chant the hymns, and so on, and that purifies the heart, and it's actually God purifying the heart. It's stated very explicitly in Bhagavatam that God cleanses the heart for somebody who's on the process, somebody who's taking shelter of Him.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to make some effort in order to be in the shower.
Yeah. So I'm going to appeal to an analogy from the Chronicles of Narnia. Theseus becomes a dragon, and he's a little boy who becomes a dragon. In order to not become a dragon, Aslan has to basically pull off his scales one piece by one piece. And of course, it's horribly painful and awful, but that's the only way to return him into a little boy again, rather than this monstrous beast. And a similar analogy is the sanctification process, the making us holy that you brought up. Yes, we do need to bring our behavior up, but even that is God working in us. It's Aslan peeling off our scales so that we can become truly human again, truly ourselves again. That to me that's grace. That's God working in us to change us, to mold us into a true human being, so that even those good actions are to God alone. Now, of course, we still have the freedom. We're still doing the temptation for the dragon in that is to stop it, to run away, to prevent the lion from doing that, because it's a horribly painful process. It's tough, it's difficult, and that's the moral journey that we all experience. So the thing I'm trying to preserve here is the idea of free will, but God is the sole active agent in the sanctification process, in the process of making us holy.
Yeah, I like that point. That's interesting. We have an idea in our theology that like, even if you can't externally, like, some people may be addicted to something, and if they just can't give it up due to whatever reason, maybe it's their karma, their mentality is to have this their karma is to have this mentality that is addicted to the certain action, and they just can't give it up. But if they can remain unenvious and still be dedicated to coming closer to God, and still praise, people who are devoted to God, then still they're elevated. Where, contrast it to somebody who has some kind of addiction which dishonors God, and they're like, and then instead of sitting with that and realizing, being humble, being unenvious, and if instead of doing that they start criticizing people who are better than them and say, these people, they think they're better than me and so on, then they're actually removing themselves from the grace by doing that. So there is this idea that as long as you can have the right mentality of just being humble and taking the grace and appreciating those people who are actually behaving better than you and their relationship with God, then you're on the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And there's a beautiful passage in John chapter 15, remain, and it's Christ speaking here, remain in me and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit on its own. It must remain in the vine. And so it's this idea of Christ being the font that gives us nourishment and allows us to grow. And all our job is to remain. It's literally abide, just to stay.
Yeah. Also, another point is like the soul choosing to sort of put its own volition by hanging on and maybe chanting God's name in our tradition. That itself is kind of a natural outspurt and a spontaneous expression of the soul's devotion in the first place. It's just sort of a byproduct of God's grace, is that the soul naturally wants to do these things of its own accord. So in one sense, you can say that it is God's grace that we're holding on, because that holding on is just a natural expression of our sort of God's grace coming through us.
Yeah, I think this is, again, the more we push each other, the closer we become.
We should probably start wrapping things up.
This has gotten quite... Yeah, this has been a monster session.
There's 2 questions from YouTube. We can deal with those and then see if there's anything else we want to touch on before we wrap up. So, Divyam, how did the first birth happen when there's no karmic account for the individual?
Oh, okay. That's easy. The soul, when it first chooses to come down, it can basically choose its birth of its own accord. Whatever birth it wants, it can choose. So, the first birth happens because it has its free will. So if it wants to come down, it can be whatever it wants to be. It usually, it's described that it's generally like a higher being with less sort of impurities than the human form. But it happens because the soul has libertarian free will and has the ability to make that choice and to choose whatever birth it wants at that instant when it's not free, when it's free from karmic baggage.
Right, and I'll get the other one. Capturing Christianity has better software than me, but it's only available on Apple. Oh, okay, that worked. Okay, Jason, if God creates us to have free will, why would one appeal to God for intervention, which could risk impacting the free will or autonomy of all humanity?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, we could probably both contribute to that one. You want to go first?
Yeah. It's interesting. So I guess we can pray to God. We can appeal to God to, end coronavirus or something. But yeah, I mean, God will intervene in people's lives to the extent that they want God to intervene in their lives. So, God, not every soul is totally averse to God. Some souls may want 20% of God's intervention. Some souls may want 50. Some souls may want 100. So, God can at least intervene to the extent that people are willing to accept Him. So, why would we appeal? We can appeal to God, and maybe through our own desire, God may be more willing to intervene to those people that want that intervention. Also, the fact, at least as far as personal, this is sort of on a group level, but on a personal level, there's sometimes the question of what's the use of petitionary prayer, because if God is, if God's just going to do what He's going to do anyway, what's the use of our desire in the process? The role of our own personal desire in the process of petitioning is that when we ask God to do something, it itself represents an indication to have God intervene in our own lives. So, God wants to intervene in our lives, and by calling out to Him, at least in our own hearts, we're opening up our own hearts and giving God space to intervene in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great answer. I mean, all I would say is it's to go back to that analogy of a play. God doesn't stand outside as a director, especially within Christian theology. He enters the play. And just as my free will doesn't impact your free will, in fact, it's the very interplay that opens up choices and opens up the possibility of relationship. So God interacting with us opens up choices for us. Like, if God didn't intervene, how would we have the offer of salvation in Christ, right? That very freedom is allowed because God came in. And it's that dynamic relationship, that ongoing relationship that actually enables free will more than it does restrict it.
So another point we could make is once you're appealing to God to get you something that you can't get without His assistance. But once you are in heaven, then at least in the Vaishnava theology, there's so much free will to be had there. There's so much going on in relationship with God. There's food and dance and song and little cliques of different people that get along, and those cliques might have a kind of pleasurable rivalry with other cliques and so on. So the free will doesn't end.
Yeah, good questions.
So that's all the questions. So I guess if there's any other final points you guys want to touch on before we wrap it up.
That was quite good. We went through quite a lot.
Covered a lot of ground. Probably need a mental break for a couple weeks now.
Yeah, that was.
But dissertation, hey, that's my evidence of hell, man. No karmic injustice could justify this.
Oh.
Actually, I mean, I've had a good time working on it. Actually, I'd beg to differ on that point.
Okay. I do too. I just like to complain. That'll be something to work out cycles.
Yeah, this is good. I'm definitely gonna. This is good even for my own dissertation. There's some points that I've kind of reached a standstill. I couldn't really think of much more, but this has given me some more food for thought. So
you got a heck of a dissertation. I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
The amount that I was able to get through. So I appreciate you sending that.
No, you really impressed me. You're going. I can see you're going places.
Appreciate it. You are too. Hope we meet up next time. Any of us are in Cambridge. Probably all three of us who get to meet my brother-in-law. We'll grab a dinner or something. Grab a coffee or something.
Yeah.
Whatever the Cambridge tradition is. I don't know what you guys do over there.
Yeah, we definitely like our food. So.
All right. Thanks for that, guys. Hopefully we can do more of these discussions in the future.
Yeah, I hope these. Has there been positive feedback from the audience? Maybe.
Yeah, there's people. I think Seth's got a few fans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay. So I'm thinking my brother-in-law posted this on his Facebook. I haven't checked because I had random people messaging me that I did not tell about this.
Yeah.
So these were already my fans. So
yeah.
Because I had two. Jason, that second question, Jason Eisenbarger, is a friend of mine.
Right. Okay. All right.
And I haven't told him about
this.
Let's
See if I can get the outro to go. But yeah, we had like 10 or so people going.